All right, today we are doing 3.6 in Algebra 2, which is the quadratic formula for solving quadratics. So if you can't factor, you can either complete the square or you can use the quadratic formula. Sometimes you'll have to use one or the other. Sometimes it's easier or better to use one or the other, completing the square or the quadratic formula. I happen to like completing the square. I think it's fun, so I like to use it more. But there's a lot of people that have the quadratic formula memorized and use it. However, on your tests and for future use, you have to be able to do both. Okay, so please make sure that you can do both of these and memorize them. Okay, so this formula needs to go in your note cards. It needs to be made. It needs to be memorized. Okay, so all we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to plug it in. So remember that this is ax squared plus bx plus c, and that's where we get these values here. So I'm going to go ahead and just write these out. So my a is my coefficient, it's my 1. My b is my coefficient, and it's 10. And my c is 2. Okay, so I'm just writing them out so that I don't have to think about it as I'm entering them. So now I'm just going to plug it into this formula. Okay, so negative b, so negative 10 plus or minus the square root b squared, so that's going to be 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2, all of that over, well, my x didn't really have to go over, all of that over 2 times my a value, which is 1. Okay, so now I'm going to start working inside of here, which is called the discriminant, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so we're going to start with inside the radicals. Okay, and this is the radical, the little square root symbol. Okay, so I'm going to have negative 10 plus or minus 10 squared is 100. So 100 minus 4 times 1 is 4 times 2 is 8. Okay. And all of that is going to go over 2 times 1, which is 2. I'm going to continue simplifying. So I have negative 10 plus or minus. So 100 minus 8 is 92. So that's the square root of 92. All of that over 2. Okay, 92 is a pretty big number. I can probably simplify it a little bit. So I'm going to take 92 and I'm going to do my little Christmas tree or my ladder, and I'm going to simplify it. Okay, so 92, I always like to start divided by 2, unless you know something else that it's divisible by. So 2 and 46. So 46 is divisible by 2 and 23. Okay, and then 23 is a prime number. Okay, so we have 2, 2, and 23. So 2 times 2 times 23 under the radical, which really means 2, that pair comes out, and the square root of 23. Okay, so now we're going to have negative 10 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 23 all over 2. Now, here is a very important thing. The only time you can use this is if you can divide both this and this by this value, okay, or simplify all 3 of these using this value. Okay, because sometimes you'll have like a 2 down here and a 4 here, and it could simplify to 1/4. But it has to be all 3 of these. Okay, so these two both have to be able to work with this one. So I can go on ahead and simplify, because negative 10 is divisible by 2 and I get negative 5. And 2 is divisible by 2 and I get 1. So that's going to be negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 23. That's all I can do with this thing. I do not want to change it. Decimals needs to be in exact form. Okay. All right, so let's go on ahead and try the next one, and I'm already inching over into its space. Okay, so A is 2, B is negative 1, make sure you keep that sign with it, and C is 2. So now I'm going to go on ahead and write this out. So I have negative B, okay. So that's going to be a negative, I guess I can write that negative 1, which is a positive 1, plus or minus the square root, negative 1 squared. Really important. Remember, if you're using your calculator, that negative 1 has to go in parentheses before you square it. Minus 4 times 2 times 2, all over 2 times my a value, which is 2. Okay, so that's going to leave me with 1 plus or minus. I'm going to simplify in here. So negative 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. Okay. So I'm going to have, let's see, over 4. So that's going to be 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 15 over 4. Okay. Now, this right now looks like you can't do it because we have not, in the apex world, we have not gotten to negative numbers yet. Okay. So for now, I'm going to say that there are no real solutions. Okay. I cannot factor this anymore. So just leave it like that and call it good. Once we get to imaginary numbers, then we'll be able to deal with that right there. Okay. Let's go on ahead and take a look at this last problem. Okay. So this last problem here, my A is 1, my B is 3, and my C is negative 7. Okay, so I'm going to have negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. So negative 3 plus or minus 3 squared, which is 9, minus, all right, so now this is where it gets tricky, minus 4 times 1 is 4, times negative 7 is negative 28. Okay, so that becomes a positive. You have to pay attention to these signs here. Okay, otherwise you're going to get stumped. Okay, all over 2, negative 3 plus or minus 28 plus 9 is what, 37? Okay, so the square root of 37 all over 2. And 37, can we do anything with it? Nope, it is a prime number, so we're done at that point. Okay, so remember, you know, if we could simplify it, we need to simplify it. Okay, so let's take a look at the discriminant. Okay, so the discriminant is really this piece right here. Okay, the b squared minus 4ac. I just circled it down here for some reason. Okay, so it's the b squared minus 4ac in our quadratic equation. Okay, it's the stuff that's under the radical. Okay, so if that stuff is greater than 0, so if you have the square root of a positive number, you're going to be touching the x-axis at some point. Okay, and it's not going to be just one point, because if I take the square root of 9, remember that gives me a positive or a negative 3. So you're going to have 2 real solutions if the discriminant is positive, or whatever's under the radical in that quadratic equation is positive. Okay. So if b squared minus 4ac equals 0, then you're really taking the square root of 0 when you're doing the quadratic equation, and there's only one real solution, because the square root of 0 is plus or minus 0, which is just 0. There is no plus or minus 0, which means you're only going to touch the x-axis at one spot. So there's one real solution. Okay. And then our last one is if it is less than 0, so if you're taking the square root of a negative number, then that's not possible, right? At least not right now. Okay. Not possible for you guys right now, and even when it is possible, it's not a real solution. Okay, it's called an imaginary number. So that means this thing is not touching the x-axis at all. So it's either starting way up here and going up, or it's starting way down here and going down. It is never touching the x-axis. Okay, so you don't actually have to remember another formula. As long as you remember in the quadratic formula, whatever you're taking the square root of tells you how many solutions there are. Okay, so let's go on ahead and let's look at this piece right here. So it says determine the number of real solutions. Well, first thing I need to do is get this in standard form. So I'm going to add 7 to both sides. So I have x squared minus 6x plus 7 equals 0. Now, thinking about the quadratic formula, I have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. That's the piece all over 2a. That's the piece I care about right there. Okay, so I'm just going to plug that one piece in. So my b is negative 6. So negative 6 squared. Make sure you put this in parentheses, especially if you're doing it in your calculator. Otherwise, you're going to get a negative 36 there. Okay, minus 4 times my a value, which is 1, times my c value, which is 7. Okay, and if you haven't moved this 7 over to make it positive, then remember, you're also going to get the wrong value. Okay, so that means I have the square root of 36 minus 4 times 7, which is 28, which gives me the square root of a positive number. So there are two real solutions. Okay, because when I take the square root of a positive number, I get both the plus and the minus. So that's going to be, let's see, what is 36 minus 28 is 8. So the square root of 8 would give me the square root, or plus or minus the square root of 8. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this one. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. So I get x squared minus 6x plus 9. Okay. So my a is 1, my b is negative 6. I didn't do this on the last problem, but just in case, you know, you guys like doing that, it helps to be able to label stuff. Okay, and now I'm going to do my quadratic formula, but I only need that piece under the radical. So I'm going to have negative 6 squared minus, not plus, minus 4 times a times c. Okay, so negative 6 squared is 36. 4 times 1 is 4, times 9 is 36. So that gives me the square root of 0, which is just 0. So there's one real solution. I'm only getting one answer when I take the square root of 0. I bet this last one's going to be no solution, but let's go on ahead and check it out. So add 11 to both sides. So I have x squared minus 6x plus 11 equals 0. And I haven't put these equal to 0, or this one, but you should. We're solving it, so it needs to be equal to something. All right, so now I'm going to take that a is 1, b is negative 6, and c is 11. I'm going to plug it in under here. So negative 6 squared minus 4 times a times c. And that gives me square root of 36 minus 44. 4 times 1 is 4, times 11 is 44. So that's going to give me the square root of a negative number, which is no real solutions. Okay, because once you guys learn imaginary, it'll be an imaginary solution. Okay, it's no real solutions. And that's it for chapter 3.6, the quadratic formula. Make sure you memorize it, study it, and know it, and do not forget it. Have a great day.